So here we go with Alexander Hamilton. This is essentially an overview of the faction fights around the Bank of the United States and related issues, starting with Hamilton Jefferson in 1792, and then going all the way to Andrew Jackson. Right? And one of my main theses is that Hamilton represents the positive forces, and of course the negative forces represented by Jefferson and Jackson. And what an obscenity it is that when the Democratic Party gathers in the springtime, right, they call it the Jefferson-Jackson dinner. This is an absolute monstrosity, right? Two slaveholders, two enemies of public credit, two enemies of national development, and that's the Democratic Party. And we also have to try to sweep aside the demagogy of the Democrats. Obviously, in the 1930s, even Franklin D. Roosevelt was not immune, right? Because the Republicans had Lincoln. Who did the Democrats have? Well, they essentially had nobody, because they were the bad guys from Jefferson all the way to 1932. The Democrats are always the bad guys. And that's one of the sad commentaries. So, Alexander Hamilton, the finest, in some ways, of the sort of second generation of founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin, obviously very much in the running, but other than that, it's Hamilton. He was born in the British West Indies, St. Croix. He was an illegitimate child, a bastard, if you will, and he was an orphan. But when he came to the mainland here, he had Machiavelli's writings in his trunk. So just like John Adams, right? John Adams is a guy who actually publishes big pieces of Machiavelli, so you know about it, and the Science of a Constitution. He has the same Machiavellian, link, and the idea is that Machiavelli is mostly slandered by British and related propaganda, right? Machiavelli is the father of the modern state. He's the creator of modern political science and the father of the modern state. So that's the positive side of Hamilton. He's kind of destitute. I think he goes to Columbia University as a scholarship boy, has to work, has to find wealthy patrons. But when the war starts, he goes and volunteers as a captain in the artillery. Notice Jefferson does no such thing. Jefferson goes to the capital of Virginia. He wants to be the governor of Virginia. And when Benedict Arnold approaches with his forces, Jefferson runs away. It's one of the most ignominious flights in recent history. So he's soon discovered by Washington, and he becomes the aide-de-camp of Washington. And especially at the Siege of Yorktown, Hamilton distinguishes himself as a hero in the attack on one of the British fortifications. So we go from Hamilton as the right-hand man to Washington in the Revolutionary War, and then a little bit later, 10 years later maybe, we get Hamilton as the right-hand man of Washington in the first cabinets. And notice, Washington supported Hamilton every time. Never Jefferson. Jefferson quit, left the government because he wasn't getting the sabotage that he wanted. And there's Hamilton again, a nice engraving. Now, Hamilton was elected as a representative, a congressman, in the Articles of Confederation government, and he saw how unworkable this was. The Articles of Confederation, of course, are exactly what Jefferson always wanted. Chaotic government, weak executive, well, no executive, the weakest of all, and no taxing authority. You had situations, where the states were putting up tariffs against each other. You had situations where different states were on the verge of war between each other over certain territories and all the rest of it. So the Articles of Confederation government from 1783 or whatever it was, say 1780 until 1789, 1790, that was just a disaster. And the whole U.S. Experiment was essentially on borrowed time. So Hamilton then sees how important it is to have a stronger central government. Now, he calls the Annapolis Convention. That's the precursor to the Philadelphia Convention. Now, you ought to come to Maryland sometime. Maryland has the oldest state capitol that's still being used, okay? The oldest. And inside that building is where the Annapolis Convention actually took place. So it was called the Annapolis Convention to Remedy Defects of Government, 1786. And you'll notice that involved here is Hamilton is not a formalist, right? The purpose of these conventions was supposed to be to rewrite or amend the Articles of Confederation Constitution, and Hamilton and then others said, we have to junk it completely. It's hopeless to try to reform the Articles of Confederation. We need a whole new approach based on the Massachusetts tripartite three branches of government, right? The executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. So they then act on that. It means from that point of view, the whole U.S. government has always been illegal from that point of view, right? If you want to be a legal crank, sick formalist, you could say, well, this is all illegal because the original process was to amend, not to completely replace. And then at the Philadelphia Convention, right, where you do get the Constitution, and he's the author of, here he's representing New York. He then becomes the author of most of the Federalist Papers, along with Madison and along with John Jay. And of course, John Jay is where we are today. Now, Jefferson, obviously I've got to play Hamilton against these villains and monsters and ogres. And again, Jefferson, he gets a very, very good press on the basis of nothing. The libertarians love him, the Confederates love him. Oh, he wanted this wonderful utopia, this agrarian paradise. It's no good. Jefferson is a great hypocrite. He writes, all men are created equal. And he's a good writer, that's for sure. He's a good propagandist, no doubt about that. But remember, he was supervised. There was a committee with Benjamin Franklin standing behind him when he wrote this stuff. So maybe it's not so Jeffersonian as we might otherwise think. So all men are created equal, but obviously this was not what he did in practice. He was a slaveholder. He supported slavery. He thought slavery was going to be the order of the day. He did no fighting in the Revolutionary War, and of course he had not just Sally Hemings, but other concubines, right? He had large numbers of illegitimate children. This has not really been tracked down. And here he is. I mean, he's like a roue. Right? You can see this, the hardened look of the sensualist, because that's what he was. And when he always had conflicts of interest going on, because the stuff that he was pushing as, you know, the way to do things generally turned out to be in favor of the slaveholders, and above all in favor of the slaveholder Thomas Jefferson. So a hypocrite. Now, Daniel Webster, although not of the first caliber, magnitude, does come in as a pretty good anti-Jackson Whig later on. And he did a eulogy, right, the speech in favor of Hamilton. And this you're going to see, this is the plaque on the Hamilton statue at the Treasury in Washington, right? He smote the rock of the national resources, and abundant streams of revenue gushed forth. He can make money come out of a rock, which is how it looked to the contemporaries. He touched the dead corpse of public credit, and it sprang upon its feet. It's a very eloquent tribute to Hamilton. So this is from later on. I just have to mention in passing, Daniel Webster tried to create the third Bank of the United States, but he failed because of the assassination of William Henry Harrison and the coming of this awful John Tyler, right? This awful, awful Confederate. So now this is the Treasury in Washington, and here's Alexander Hamilton, and that plaque is on the base of this statue. You ought to go and see it. But it's in the back. It's in the back entrance of the Treasury. In the front, we have this other guy, the anti-Hamilton, Alfred Gallatin, a Swiss banker Imagine this. And he was the favorite of the Democrats. Let's see, I have a picture of him. I'm just not sure where. All right, we'll get to it later. So Jefferson is responsible for all the garbage that leads to the Civil War, right? He wants nullification, right? That states can simply void federal laws. States can shield individuals from federal warrants. That's interposition, right? You interpose the power of the federal, the individual state against that of the central government. And when they say states' rights, we could do a whole unit on this. When they say states' rights, there's only one state's right that they mean. It is the state's right to slavery. When these states seceded in 1860 and 1861, not one of them cited states' rights in the abstract or the tariff or any such issue. It's only slavery. Slavery, slavery, slavery. So there we have, always slavery. Now, Jefferson is also responsible for the stupidest and most subversive theory, which is that of the enumerated powers. So he says, the Constitution is like a menu, and the only thing you can do is order what's on the menu. And therefore, it has to be the ones that are actually enumerated, right, that are mentioned in the Constitution. Now, that comes down to then the 17 specific clauses. I think it's more than 17 powers, but it's 17 clauses with different powers listed in them. Article 1, Section 8, clauses 1 to 17. Those are the only powers that Congress has. He contributes also a complete mangling and misreading of the 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says any powers that are not given to the government or others are reserved for the states and the people. It's a mangling. And it ignores, above all, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, right? 17 clauses here, one clause here. And this is called the elastic clause. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, in other words, the 17, and all other powers vested in this Constitution by the U.S. government or any department or officer thereof. So this is very broad, and Hamilton says you have to look at that in the broadest and most liberal fashion. Take a look at our briefing from sometime in the last couple of weeks. We had the whole quotes from Hamilton's defense of the Bank of the United States, and he tells you in there how to read the Constitution. Anyway, Jefferson tells you how to read it like a Confederate, right? Only enumerated powers. Now, Hamilton says, no. We have implied powers, and indeed we have inherent powers. The inherent powers are, if you're a sovereign state and you look around the world, you automatically have a whole series of powers that are simply there by virtue of the fact that you're a sovereign state. Like if you conquer territory, you have the right to police it, right? You can establish a military government. That's not so much in the Constitution. So those are inherent. Any government, any state has inherent powers. But then there are the implied powers. So the way this turned up was, it comes on the Bank of the United States, right? That's the issue. That's where the whole thing starts. The split between Jefferson and Hamilton starts on the bank. And that's where the Federalists and the Whigs originate. But now we're in the middle of that process. We're in a debate where the Bank of the United States has passed the House, passed the Senate, and it's in Washington's cabinet. And here Jefferson comes forward, the Secretary of State, and says, this is unconstitutional. It violates the enumerated powers. And Madison acts as his stooge. These people are tremendously overblown, right? They're referred to as if they were heroes and demigods. They're not. They're half-wits. Okay? That's Jefferson and Madison. It's unconstitutional. So Hamilton wrote that opinion, which we put out in the briefing, where he shows that the Bank of the United States is completely constitutional under the implied powers. In other words, the necessary and proper, right? Because you can argue, in the preamble it says the general welfare. So anything that advances the general welfare and is not forbidden by the Constitution can be done. So there it is. If the goal is constitutional, the general welfare, let's say, or the common defense, or many others, domestic tranquility, right? Any of those. If the goal is constitutional and the means not forbidden, go for it. That's a liberal and expansive and viable reading of the Constitution. And this is exactly confirmed by another great person, right? He's almost up there with Hamilton in terms of what he did. Because in this terrible time when we had Jefferson, Madison, Monroe got better at the end. But Jefferson, Madison, awful. The country was saved by John Marshall, who became the Chief Justice, right, of Virginia. But he's a nationalist, right? He's not a Virginian, he's U.S. nationalist. And that's the case called McCulloch versus Maryland. And John Marshall says pretty much the same thing. If the goal is constitutional and the means are not forbidden and the whole thing looks like it's desirable, go for it. And that, my friends, is the origin of big government. Okay. Now, here's Jefferson's problem. Jefferson is, of course, an idiot. But the one thing I will give to Jefferson, he's not stupid enough to believe his own propaganda. In other words, Jefferson is doing a job for the slaveholders. He says, I want a weak government, I want a weak army, or better yet, no army, so you'll never be able to come and take my slaves away, right? But then comes the Louisiana Purchase. So Napoleon says to him, look, I'm going to sell you this entire Louisiana territory. Don't you want it? So poor Jefferson goes into a mental crisis because he says, wait a minute, territorial expansion is not on the list of the enumerated powers. Doesn't say anything about that. So Jefferson, therefore, had to negate his own doctrine in order to operate in this world and said, okay, we're going to buy Louisiana. But he only did that essentially sacrificing his principles, but he kept preaching the principles after that nevertheless. Now, it ought to be clear, the U.S. Constitution is not a suicide pact. Right? In other words, you've got to read this with a certain amount of realism and political good sense. Now, the libertarians, we're amazed, of course, right? Because for years we've been hearing from all the libertarians that Ron Paul and Rand Paul and Senator Mike Lee and all these people, those are the defenders of the Constitution, right? Those guys, they don't want big government, they want the enshrined values. So we've heard the sanctimonious, pedantic reading of the Constitution by Ron Paul and his Freemasonic faction. And again, it's the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite Freemasons, right? You can also see, by the way, the Mormons, right, in Utah. The Mormons essentially wanted to be a separate government, and they would say, the Constitution is divinely inspired, and we love the Constitution, but the officers of the United States are all criminals, and we're going to shoot them on sight. That was their approach. That was Brigham Young, for example. Read my book about it. It deserves more attention than it got. So look, they're telling us about the Constitution, and now we have Trump, and all of that is out the window within seconds. All of that boring, hypocritical posturing about the Constitution, all gone. Trump attacks the general welfare. Remember, the general welfare is in the Constitution not once, but twice, in the preamble and in the tasks of the Congress, right? Then we have the First Amendment, free speech, violated by Trump. Fifth Amendment, due process, violated by Trump. 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship, or jus soli, the law of the soil, I guess, also out. There are more. There are provisions about eminent domain that one would need to look into. Constitution talks about eminent domain. And Trump does too, but the way Trump means it is, I can steal anything you have and take it, right? That Mar-a-Lago, that was willed by Marjorie Merriweather Post to the federal government to be a Southern White House. And somehow Trump got control of this thing. I haven't been able to figure out how. Yeah. Okay. The other thing we have to remember, this Constitutional Convention. This would be a monstrous zoo. This would be a playground for crackpots, fascists. The FBI would be there in force. The CIA would be there in force. We have to be very frank and very realistic. The current generation of humanity is so far inferior to the Founding Fathers, to people like Hamilton. This would be an adventure leading into, I think, a world conflagration and a world tragedy. No to the Constitutional Convention. No, no, never. Now, there's some interesting problems with Jefferson, right? If people will say, well, if he's such a big friend of the slavocrats and the Southern plantation slaveholders, why is he so in favor of the crazy French Revolution, right? Why does he support the Jacobins and the Reign of Terror and Robespierre and the guillotine? And the answer seems to be that he accumulated huge debts in London, and he thought that if they had a war with the British, then his debts could be canceled. So therefore, that's the basis of his support for the French Revolution, which is always puzzling. Now, here's Gallatin. This is Albert Gallatin, Swiss-born, okay? Banker from Geneva. And there's a whole group of these people in the first 40, 50 years of the U.S. He is a Geneva Swiss banker. There's a phase where the Swiss bankers seem to merge with the British, right? Like, you know, Major André, the guy who was working with Benedict Arnold to deliver West Point to the British, he was Swiss. So here's another Swiss. He is the anti-Hamilton. His statue is in the front of the Treasury. Gallatin, the traitor, the wrecker. He started the Whiskey Rebellion. This is amazing. He was a congressman from Western Pennsylvania, and when Hamilton came in, Hamilton said we can get money from a tariff, and we can get money from an excise tax on luxury goods. Now, I think politically, I don't know, but he included whiskey as one of the luxury goods, which I guess is an argument. But this guy was the congressman out there, and he gave a push to an armed rebellion in Western Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion. And George Washington thought that was so serious that George Washington himself assumed command of an army and was on his way to put it down, right, with force when these people surrendered. But this is the subversive. So the point about him, though, is he was Secretary of the Treasury twice, for Jefferson and for Madison. And he ruined whatever else would have happened. He made sure that these were disasters. And his idea was pay down the public debt, deflation, economic insanity. Pay down the public debt and cut military spending so that by the time you get to the War of 1812, the U.S. essentially has no army and no navy, thanks to him. So the British can run wild for 6 months, 12 months, whatever. And eventually the U.S. bounces back, but not thanks to him. So when they tell you how great Jefferson and Madison were as presidents, those guys never were presidents. That was the president, Gallatin. And he went on then for quite a while. So look, here's the Hamilton modernization program. First of all, you have to take all the bonds that were issued by the states to finance the Revolutionary War. You have to bring those together and issue U.S. Treasury bonds against them. And since this is a funded debt, in other words, it's getting paid off, getting turned over, you can issue U.S. Treasury bonds, and those can be used as money. And we'll get to this question of money, because a lot of this stuff revolves around having money to use, having capital in just about any form. So a funded national debt, a protective tariff. He got it as protective as he could. It's not exactly ideal, but he did push hard in that direction. He wanted to industrialize the country, so that's the report on manufacturing. He wanted to build infrastructure, and you go back and you look at this absurd fetish. They'd say, well, the federal government can't build it if it's only in one state. What the hell is that? If it's a project of national interest, it can be, in Manhattan alone, and that would deserve federal funding. And he's a member of the Anti-Slavery Society, so he's probably the most militant anti-slavery guy of the Founding Fathers. And science and technology, right? Promoting patents, promoting scientific modernization. It's the spirit that led then to the National Academy of Sciences and so forth, the things that went on with Joseph Henry. Now we're getting some kind of a thing over here. We have a technocrat could look in. All right, so look, the thing about the Bank of the United States you have to understand is this is where the parties began, right? The first party system starts with this, that Hamilton and Jefferson split over this. So the Bank of the United States debate, BUS means B-U-S, Bank of the United States. So this is the origin of the first party system, right? For the first 36 years, I guess. Remember, the North is generally pro-Bank of the United States, the South anti. Now, here's an interesting book. Claude Bowers writes this book, Jefferson and Hamilton. This is one of the main sources of the mythology of Jefferson as a great man, because this is a study of the clash of Jefferson and Hamilton. And Bowers is on the side of Jefferson because Jefferson represents the people, except he represents the Virginia slaveholding latifundist landlords, right? That's a nice, pretty definition of the people. Anyway, he says, look, with the Southerners, for the Southerners, banks were a rarity, and for the Westerners, banks were as meaningless as the canals on Mars. And that would be Andrew Jackson, right? Because that's the West. When they say West, they don't mean California. They mean Trans-Appalachia, right? Between Appalachian Mountains to Mississippi River. The advantages, sorry about that, the advantages of such an institution were not felt among the Southerners and the Westerners. So it's the beginning of regionalism and sectionalization. Now, the British had, some say, an informal death watch on the U.S. Some say a formal, actually a committee in the Foreign Office that could say, well, how many more months until those damn rebels collapse? And that's what they were doing. They kept the death watch going, and the British way to accelerate this is to promote these periodic U.S. panics. You had to think a little bit about money. You want to have a money economy. A barter economy is not going to be sufficient. You need a money economy. So that means you have to have circulating money. If you're the United States, right, with a very weak situation at the beginning especially, how do you do that? How do you get sufficient money so that even transactions like in the Great Lakes region among fur trappers or something can be conducted with money? How are you going to do that? Or in the West or in the South, as we say, right, in these sort of backwaters. How do you get a money circulation that's enough to promote trade? Because if you don't, you're actually strangling economic activity in general. Now, there were state banks. Now, the state banks, there's no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. There are these state banks. They claim to have some gold and silver, and they put out a whole bunch of banknotes. So what you'd see would be a banknote of a bank, the Commerce Bank of Cincinnati or something. But who knew what that was? And the uncertainty was so great that that stuff was a depreciated currency. In other words, they'd probably have a list and they'd say, oh, the Commerce Bank of Cincinnati will give you 30 cents on the dollar. But when the Bank of the United States comes along, it's 100 cents on the dollar. And therefore, these state banks start screaming and yelling that this is unfair competition and so forth. But the main issue is the London bank rate. It was the British, they could take a 3% rate and they could make it 5% overnight. And when that happened, the giant sucking sound would begin. In other words, the money would get sucked across the Atlantic. Because if you had gold and you could get 2% for your gold in the US or whatever it is, the British can always top that. And as soon as the British top that rate, you got to send your gold to London. And at that point, the paper circulation in the US collapses. See? The giant sucking sound, the gold and silver goes across the pond. The US monetary circulation, already depressed, goes down even further. And this is what happened in the Panic of 1837. We'll get to this in a minute. But you see, 1837, 1857, 1893, those are all US depressions, but they're directly caused by London. That the London thing has gone into a panic, the British have raised the bank rate, and the gold and silver has fled back. So it means the US has no defense. One of the big things, let's see if we talk about this here, well, with Hamilton, is he said, look, we have to get the Bank of the United States between us and the British so that they're not able to simply do this. In other words, you've got to be able to retain sufficient circulating medium, sufficient specie meaning gold and silver, so that we can carry on normal, orderly economic activity. So this is one of the huge benefits. So again, here's the issue. Do you have enough cash money, for circulation, or will you have a barter economy? The Bank of the United States was extremely conservative, very defensive. They had a reserve ratio of 40%. In other words, they kept 40% of the money in the bank and lent out the rest, because they wanted to make sure that any panic that started, they could stop it simply by being solvent, right? And they succeeded so well. Here we have one of the most famous scoundrels of the age, the French foreign minister Talleyrand, who went from the Bourbon to the Revolution and to Napoleon then. And he would boast, he'd say, my American shares are the best thing I ever bought. So here you have a monster, right? I always try to tell people how evil can be forced to do good. Here we have the monster, Talleyrand, saying, look, I bought these shares. I'm providing liquidity for U.S. economic development. Of course, he's getting paid. See, the philosophy of Hamilton is, if you're this weak financially, you've got to win these plutocrats over to you, because otherwise you can't get anywhere. So you cannot default on debt. You got to pay the state bonds from the Revolution, and you've got to essentially make it worth their while, because you're going to be gaining more than they are. So the general idea is the infrastructure at the beginning is modest, but whatever went on, it's all from the first Bank of the United States, right? In other words, to the extent that you're building some turnpikes and things like this, eventually it's going to get into canals and then railroads, right? And you're going to see that's the second Bank of the United States. But here it's basically having money, not being subjected to the British panics. There's also, this is the first Bank of the United States. I'm sorry about how that turned out, but it's in Philadelphia. It's the original. What happened to this was after Jackson, after the charter expired, right? The first charter is 1791 to 1811, and after that, this was it was sold off. I guess somebody else bought it. So there it is. We should eventually organize a trip up there, right? That's in Philadelphia. The government needs a depository system, a stable, reliable banker for the U.S. federal government with many branches. And this is what filled the bill. So you can get tax revenues deposited, and it's all the business that needs to go on. If you don't have that, if you're dealing with some crazy state bank, you don't know what it's going to blow up from one minute to the next. So you may find your whole tax revenue for the year gone because of some embezzler in a bank. Now, who were the enemies of the first Bank of the United States? Well, the bankers, because they said, we don't want the first Bank of the United States to control and finance the public debt of the United States. We, the parasitical, predatory bankers, we want to control the public debt of the United States. And this is one of the worst, right? John Jacob Astor, He's a predator. He's an adventurer. He has this fur business in the Pacific Northwest. As you can see, he's the first U.S. multimillionaire. This is the Trump tradition starting here. The first multimillionaire in the country, constantly meddling in politics, constantly perverting the public will. He was the richest man in the United States. He owned virtually Martin Van Buren and this labor machine in New York and the so-called Albany Regency, right? Really a dictatorship. His descendants, of course, supported Hitler. That was called the Clifton set. Written Cliveden, but they want you to say Clifton. Clifton. So that was Lady Astor, John Jacob Astor, and they were the ones who ran Sir Neville Chamberlain. Right? He was their creature. He was the puppet master of Andrew Jackson. So he says, again, I don't want that public bank. And the way that works, the bank is 1/5 of it is government, right? 1/5 of the shares are bought by the U.S. government and 1/5 of the seats on the board. So there's an 80% private interest, but of course those guys have got to be confronted with the fact that they have to help to stop a panic, because otherwise they will get wiped out, right, if they don't. So it forces them into some interesting, helpful activities. So this is the first. John Jacob Astor had personally bailed out lots of people in the Andrew Jackson cabinet, like Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, supporter of Jackson. Guy had been bankrupt personally, and this guy saved him, right? And he did this with a lot of people. Now, here's another one. Stephen Girard of Philadelphia. This is the Girard Bank. I hope you've heard of him. The fourth richest American of all time. In other words, if you do the comparison, at least at the time this was written, you compare his fortune to the GDP, he turns out to be number 4. And what he did, the trick was that when the original charter of the bank, which was 20 years, when it lapsed in 1811, 1812, and you can see this is a critical time. It's the verge of the War of 1812, huh? And when that lapsed, Girard tried to take over the federal debt, and Astor also tried to take over the federal debt. And the way it actually turned out was Astor was in the process of taking over the federal debt with the help of Gallatin, right, in the Jefferson cabinet, and Girard took over the state of Pennsylvania. In other words, he got control of the seals and the stamps and the official paraphernalia of the state of Pennsylvania. So here he is. He took over Pennsylvania. He said, I can't have the whole country. I'll just take Pennsylvania, which was a very large piece of the action. All right. So now by the time we get to the second Bank of the United States, this is 1816 to 1836. This takes us up to Jackson. Here you're going to get canals and infrastructure. And this was, according to some measures, the largest corporation in the world. Okay? So this meant that this little, weak, isolated country could still command tremendous resources because of having this Hamiltonian credit system. Now there's the second bank of the United States in Philadelphia. They're not that far apart. It's sort of in that Independence Mall area, not too far afield. A great place to visit. You can see neoclassical. They loved it. And it was a great institution. How about this one? The Erie Canal, 1825. So the Erie Canal in 1825 is under the terms of the second Bank of the United States. Now, anybody ever been to Lockport? Oh, man. If you ever go to Niagara Falls, I tell you that Lockport is more interesting than Niagara Falls. You should go see Lockport. It's when the Erie Canal is coming along the plain of the Mohawk River, and it's got to go up. I think it's called the Niagara Escarpment. And it has to go up 5 locks in a row. And here you see some of them. Here they've taken down the sluice gates, but it's Lockport, okay? And it's got to go up several hundred feet in a very, very short order. So this was, at the time, one of the great engineering achievements of the world. And this was brought to you not by Citibank, but by the Second Bank of the United States. They provided that credit. Now, I guess we've done it, right? John Jacob Astor is an enemy in 1811. Gerard will later buy the building. That was what I was trying to get at. This was later bought by Gerard when Jackson refused to grant the prolongation of the charter. I tried to destroy it. Gerard took over that building. Okay? And the idea was, as soon as the Bank of the United States is no longer there, the private predators rush in and try to take over. Now, again, we've gone through this dynamic of how the British waged financial warfare by raising the London bank rate and pulling the hot money across the Atlantic. And then we come to this degraded, ravaged, harrowed specimen, right? This borderline psychotic Andrew Jackson comes from the West, right? Thinks banks are like the canals on Mars, hates banks. He says, I read something about how the banks are bad. Of course, he's responding to the fact that Astor and Gerard and Gallatin still are sending him messages, don't let that bank survive, right? That's a bad thing. So here's what he does, Jackson's folly. He refuses to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. He puts U.S. funds in the so-called pet banks. Pet banks were state banks, very unstable, extremely unreliable. So he would put the U.S. money in pet banks owned by land speculators. The result of all this is a huge real estate bubble, and he's going to pop his own bubble with the Specie Circular of 1836, saying you can only pay for land in gold and silver. So he's essentially popped his own bubble. The result is total depression. This is where the land office business expression comes from. This is especially the Specie Circular. Again, specie means gold and silver. So if you want to buy land and speculate in land, at a certain point you got to pay in gold and silver, which nobody has. And that brings on this panic. Now, you may want to come up here and actually look at this. This is a contemporary cartoon of the Panic of 1837. See, a lot of people are getting drunk. A lot of people are out in the streets. If you read this stuff, it says, land office, only gold and silver accepted under Specie Circular. Anyway, this is, you can see everybody's standing around. The commerce is collapsing and what have you. In the Harrison administration, Daniel Webster tries for the third bank. The Panic of 1857 is that way. The National Bank is not a central bank. We can go through this another time. Grover Cleveland, unfortunately, surrendered. Aaron Burr was really bad, and there we have it. And what I wonder is if in that Hamilton play, do they understand what Burr represents? Do they understand Gallatin? Because Gallatin is the colossal villain of all this stuff. So Gerard, Astor, Gallatin representing the Swiss. Those are the enemies. And that's who controls Andrew Jackson. So the populists turned out to be no good.